April 1945. World War II, that had once promised glory, now smelled only of smoke, hunger, and defeat. In the fields of Hessen, 16-year-old Hans-Georg Henke, a Hitler Youth anti-aircraft helper, crouched behind a collapsed wall, clutching his rifle with trembling hands. For weeks, he had defended the ruins of Germany, manning a flak gun until the ammunition ran out. Now, there were no orders, no officers, only fear and silence broken by the distant grind of American tanks. He was exhausted, half-starved, his uniform hanging loose on a frame that had not finished growing. For years, he had been told that the Americans were monsters, killers who tortured prisoners and slaughtered civilians. His training had drilled it into him. Better to die for the Führer than surrender to beasts who show no mercy. As the tanks drew closer, Hans-Georg pressed his face into the dirt. He could hear voices foreign, deep, confident, the clank of metal boots, the shouts in English. He waited for the final shot that would end it. But instead came a voice, broken but clear, calling in rough German, "Junge, Waffenrunter, komm raus, we won't shoot." Hans froze. Boy. Not an enemy, not target. Boy. It had to be a trick. The propaganda said Americans never took prisoners alive, but the war had shown him too many lies already. Officers who fled, promises that vanished, and a nation collapsing around him. Slowly, with trembling hands, he set down his weapon and raised his arms. From behind the tank, 3 American soldiers appeared. They were enormous in their combat gear, faces hardened by war, and one of them was black, a man Hans had been taught to fear above all. The propaganda said men like him were savages without mercy. But when the soldier reached him, he didn't raise a weapon. He handed him a canteen. "Trinken." The soldier said quietly, "Drink." Hans stared in disbelief. The water was clean, cool, real. He drank as if it were the first water he had ever tasted. When he finished, the soldier nodded and pointed toward a group of other prisoners, boys no older than him, some already eating from American rations. No shouting, no cruelty, no revenge. Hans-Georg stood there, trembling, unable to speak. His world, built on fear and falsehood, was crumbling in front of him. The enemies he had been told were monsters had given him water instead of bullets, mercy instead of death. That moment, a boy, a drink of water, and an act of simple humanity would mark the beginning of his transformation. This is the story of how American soldiers faced German child soldiers in the final days of World War II and chose to teach them kindness rather than revenge, and how compassion ended where hatred began. As Hans-Georg and countless others were captured, the world around them revealed the last desperate madness of a regime unwilling to surrender. By late 1944, Adolf Hitler had issued his final delusional decree, the creation of the Volkssturm, or People's Storm, a so-called nation in arms, meant to stop the Allies through sheer willpower. Every male between 16 and 60 was conscripted, but by the final months of the war, the lines on paper meant nothing. Boys as young as 12 were pulled from schools, and men in their 60s were dragged from retirement homes, armed with little more than desperation and slogans. Across bombed-out cities and smoking villages, Hitler Youth members were turned overnight into soldiers. They received barely a week of training, sometimes just a day, before being thrown against seasoned Allied forces equipped with tanks, artillery, and air support. Their weapons were relics: old rifles from the First World War, captured Soviet carbines, and the crude Panzerfaust, a one-shot anti-tank launcher that was often as dangerous to the user as to the enemy. Germany called it a people's army. In truth, it was the last gasp of a dictatorship feeding on its own children. Many of these boys believed what they had been taught since childhood, that to surrender was cowardice, that death for the Führer was the highest honor. Nazi propaganda had been relentless, poisoning young minds with stories of Allied cruelty and German heroism. They were told that capture meant torture, that mercy was weakness, that foreigners were monsters. But when those children finally met the Americans advancing through their shattered streets, they discovered a truth no propaganda could survive. The soldiers who captured them did not torture them. They gave them water, they shared rations, they offered blankets. For the Americans, these weren't enemies, they were kids. Children turned into soldiers by a regime collapsing under its own lies. And for the first time, those children began to see that the world beyond Nazi propaganda was not built on hate, but on humanity. Long before the final battles of 1945, the Nazi regime had been preparing its children for death. For nearly a decade, German youth had been taught not to think, only to obey. From the age of 10, boys entered the Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth, where school lessons were replaced with military drills, racial ideology, and slogans promising eternal glory for sacrifice. They learned how to march before they learned how to reason. They learned how to salute before they learned how to question. Every story, every film, every radio broadcast had one message: the Allies were monsters. British and American soldiers were said to slaughter prisoners, burn villages, and rape women. Soviet soldiers were portrayed as demons from the East. The Führer was a father figure, and dying for him was portrayed as the highest act of loyalty. To retreat was cowardice. To surrender was treason. By 1944, this propaganda had replaced reality. Teachers handed out cyanide capsules to children in classrooms. Hitler Youth leaders promised paradise to those who fell in battle. Newspapers printed tales of 12-year-olds who destroyed tanks with grenades and were declared heroes of the Reich. These stories were often lies, but they worked. Thousands of boys, convinced that surrender meant torture, chose to fight to the death. For them, fear was a weapon more powerful than any rifle. It created an army of children willing to die for an illusion. It turned innocence into ammunition. When American soldiers advanced into Germany, they found that illusion waiting for them not in speeches or parades, but in terrified eyes behind sandbags and doorways. These were not fanatics by choice. They were victims of years of manipulation, indoctrinated to believe mercy was impossible. One captured 16-year-old near Würzburg later confessed, "I thought they would skin us alive. When they didn't, I couldn't understand. Everything I had believed just fell apart." The propaganda had done its job. It made children fight their liberators. And when those children were shown mercy instead of death, the lies began to die with them. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the fighting changed. Gone were the disciplined Wehrmacht divisions of earlier years. What the Americans began facing were children, frightened, exhausted boys in oversized uniforms, clutching rifles they barely knew how to use. In the small towns of Hessen, Nuremberg, and Leipzig, US infantry patrols moved cautiously through the rubble, expecting ambushes, and found terrified teenagers with shaking hands behind the barrels of Panzerfausts. They fired not from hatred, but from panic. Many didn't even understand what they were defending anymore. For the American soldiers, the realization came slowly, painfully. The enemies shooting at them were no longer hardened soldiers. They were boys who looked like their own sons or younger brothers back home. It created a moral chaos that no field manual could explain. Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 3rd Infantry Division remembered the moment his platoon stormed a building near Nuremberg after taking heavy fire. Inside, they found 5 young Germans, none older than 15. 2 were dead, 3 surrendered, sobbing uncontrollably, terrified they'd be executed on the spot. "The guy next to me started crying," Mitchell said years later. "He had a son at that age. We'd just killed children." American soldiers hesitated. Some froze. Others couldn't bring themselves to fire. A few paid with their lives for that moment's mercy, but most tried to hold their fire longer than they should have, shouting in broken German, "Junge, leg dein Waffe nieder. Drop your weapon, boy." Across Germany, this scene repeated itself. Young Germans firing until their courage broke, then standing in stunned disbelief as the Americans they had been taught to fear offered them life instead of death. Captured child soldiers were given water, medical care, food, and sometimes even chocolate. The fear in their eyes slowly faded into confusion that often turned to tears. They had been told Americans were monsters, but the men before them were treating them like frightened human beings. The front lines were crumbling, and with each surrender, so too was the illusion of Nazi propaganda. Mercy simple. Human mercy was doing what no bullet could. War tests every conviction, and mercy is often the first casualty. But in the spring of 1945, mercy became the weapon that defined the American advance. Across collapsing German towns, US soldiers found themselves making split-second moral choices that no training had prepared them for. The orders were clear: neutralize all armed resistance. The reality was unbearable. That resistance often came from boys barely tall enough to shoulder a rifle. Private Eugene Henderson, serving with the 9th Army, described his rule of engagement in a letter home. If I saw a kid with a gun, I'd do everything I could to make him drop it before I fired. I learned how to yell, "Leg dein Waffe nieder," in German. Sometimes they'd freeze, sometimes they'd run, but if they stopped, I couldn't shoot. I wasn't built for that. Many American soldiers felt the same. They waited longer than was safe. They risked their own lives trying to spare children who didn't know how to surrender. Some were killed for hesitating, yet others believed it was the only way to stay human in a war that had already cost too much of their souls. Commanders noticed. Informal policies began to emerge. When child soldiers were captured, they were treated differently. They were given extra food, separated from older prisoners, and provided medical care first. Interrogations were gentler. Some units even assigned chaplains to talk with them, not as enemies, but as lost children caught in history's darkest lie. For the American soldiers, the conflict became deeply personal. They'd spent months fighting across Europe, losing friends in hedgerows, forests, and frozen fields. And now, at the end, they were being asked to show compassion toward the sons of the enemy that had destroyed so much. It was not weakness, it was strength, a quiet defiance against the hatred that had consumed Europe. One soldier later said, "We realized we weren't just ending a war, we were deciding what kind of peace would follow." Every time an American soldier chose restraint over revenge, humanity reclaimed a piece of the world Hitler had tried to destroy. For thousands of captured Hitler Youth soldiers, the war ended not with bullets but with disbelief. When American troops gathered the teenage prisoners in makeshift holding areas, the boys waited for torture, for execution, for the horrors their propaganda had promised. But none came. They were given water, then rations, then blankets. A medic walked the line, bandaging wounds with quiet efficiency. Guards stood watch, not with cruelty, but with calm professionalism. There were no beatings, no humiliation, just order, food, and rest. 16-year-old Hans-Georg Henke had been shaking uncontrollably when the US 9th Army captured him in Hessen. His body was starving, his nerves shattered by days of shelling and the collapse of everything he'd believed in. An American soldier, a tall man with dark skin and kind eyes, offered him a canteen. "Trinken," he said in broken German. "Drink." The boy hesitated, expecting a trick. But the water was clean, cold, and real. That moment, one gesture of compassion broke through years of fear and indoctrination. The barbarian had shown mercy. The enemy had offered life. For the first time, Hans-Georg began to understand how completely he'd been lied to. In the following weeks, he and other captured youth were sent to POW camps near Mannheim and Remagen. There, the Americans fed them regularly, treated their wounds, and even provided education. Some learned English from guards who brought them books. Others were given writing paper to contact surviving families. The camps became, unintentionally, centers of psychological unlearning, places where Hitler's myths died quietly under warm meals and fair treatment. One young prisoner later wrote, "They treated us better than our officers ever had. That broke something in us and healed something else." For these children, captivity became redemption. They were no longer soldiers. They were boys again, frightened, hungry, and slowly rediscovering what it meant to be human. By late 1945, the long journey home began. The camps that had once held tens of thousands of captured youth were now quiet. The boys who had arrived trembling and malnourished were leaving in clean uniforms, carrying Red Cross letters and American-issued food parcels. They were alive, something their families had never expected. When Hans-Georg Henke was released from captivity, he returned to a Germany that no longer existed. The Reich that had promised him glory was a landscape of ashes. His hometown in Hessen lay in ruins, the houses hollowed by bombs, the streets filled with silence and hunger. His father had died on the Eastern Front. His mother, barely surviving, could hardly recognize the healthy, well-fed son who appeared at her door. She wept when she saw him. She had believed he was dead. All the propaganda had said that captured soldiers were executed, especially Hitler Youth. But instead of death, her son had been fed, treated, and returned alive by the very Americans who were supposed to be monsters. Across Germany, this story repeated again and again. Boys who were expected to die came home alive, some carrying chocolate, others letters from American guards who had treated them like sons. For their families, it shattered years of Nazi conditioning in a single instant. Everything they had been told about the enemy had been a lie. Many of those former child soldiers would later dedicate their lives to peace, democracy, and rebuilding. They had seen firsthand what hatred had created and what compassion had repaired. One former Volkssturm youth later wrote, "They spared us when they didn't have to. That mercy is why I never again believed in hate." Hans-Georg carried that lesson for the rest of his life. The man who had once fired at American planes would one day tell his children that the moment he was given water by an American soldier was the moment he truly became free. The war ended in silence. No more air raid sirens, no speeches, no parades. Just silence, the kind that follows unimaginable loss. But within that silence, something unexpected began to grow. For the boys who had been sent to die in Hitler's final days and were spared instead, mercy became the foundation of everything that came after. They had been raised to worship strength, but it was compassion that saved them. They had been taught to fear their enemies, but it was those enemies who gave them food, warmth, and life. Historians would later record that between 40,000 and 60,000 German child soldiers fought against the Western Allies in 1945. Of those captured, more than 95% survived. In American custody, they were treated not as war criminals, but as children caught in a tragedy not of their making. They were clothed, healed, and eventually returned to their families. It was one of the quietest acts of humanity in a war defined by destruction, and one that would shape the future of a nation. Many of those former Hitler Youth boys grew into men who rejected everything they had been forced to believe. Some became teachers, others doctors, a few even peace activists. They carried with them a single lesson carved out of rubble and fear, that mercy, when shown in the darkest hour, can rebuild what hate has destroyed. For Hans-Georg Henke, that truth lasted a lifetime. He would later describe that day in Hessen not as defeat, but as awakening. "When the American gave me water," he once said, "it wasn't just mercy. It was freedom from fear, from lies, from everything the war had made of me. The war had turned children into soldiers. But mercy, simple, quiet, human mercy, turned them back into children again." And in that act of compassion, the victors proved something far greater than power. They proved civilization itself had survived.